Welcome back. No long intro today. We're getting right into it. So what are we diving into this time? Stay with me all the way through. One quick thing before we start. For this entire video, you'll only see me as a silhouette in a dark bedroom. No graphics, no cutaways. That's intentional. I want you locked in on the story, not distracted by visuals. We're surrounded by fast, loud, overstimulating content every single day. Flashing screens, quick cuts, endless noise, and little by little, it's trained us to watch everything, but actually listen to nothing. I don't want that here. December 10th, 1995. A veteran homicide detective stepped through the front door of a home tucked along a quiet suburban street in Tucson, Arizona. The neighborhood was calm. The house was not. Another officer guided him down a narrow hallway and stopped at a bedroom. The detective glanced inside and went still. He'd worked countless scenes over the years. Violence didn't usually rattle him, but this one was staggering. Blood coated the walls. It streaked across the floors. It soaked into the mattress. The room looked like something catastrophic had happened there. Every visual cue screamed homicide, except for one glaring detail. There was no body. Before we unravel how that's possible, if you're drawn to stories that live in the strange, the dark, and the unsettling, you're exactly where you need to be. That's what we do here. And we do it often. 2, 3, sometimes 4 stories a week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, go ahead and booby-trap that like button. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Don't miss what's coming next. Now, rewind 2 days. December 8th, 1995. Inside her Tucson home, 41-year-old Bonnie Sandborn set a box of cereal on the dining room table and called out for her 3 children to come eat. Within moments, her youngest, 10-year-old Brandon, rushed in and dropped into his seat. Bonnie poured herself a cup of coffee and headed down the hallway to check on her 13-year-old daughter, Candace. Candace stood at her mirror, focused on makeup. When reminded that school was about to start, she responded with a dramatic eye roll and a quick assurance that she'd be out shortly. Bonnie continued down the hall and stopped at the closed door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. She knocked. No answer. She raised her voice, warning him that if he didn't get up immediately, she would come in and pull him out of bed herself. Silence. She leaned closer, pressing her ear against the door. She expected to hear blankets shifting or drawers sliding open. Instead, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from inside, metal striking metal in uneven bursts. It was out of place. Wrong. Without hesitating further, Bonnie turned the knob and stepped inside. Bradley wasn't in bed. He and his 18-year-old friend Jason Horbachevsky were crouched in the center of the room. Between them sat a bulky metal box. In their hands, a crowbar and a hammer. They were trying to force it open. Bonnie moved farther in and noticed a telephone receiver dangling from the side of the box. It wasn't just scrap metal. It was a payphone, a street payphone, one that clearly didn't belong in her son's bedroom. They had stolen it, and now they were attempting to break it apart to get the coins inside. Stunned, Bonnie managed only 3 words. "What are you doing?" Bradley glanced up at her, completely unbothered. "What? We're just getting the change out of it." Before she could respond, Jason looked back over his shoulder and laughed, casual, almost amused. The way he laughed made Bonnie question whether he was under the influence of something. She stepped back into the hallway, heart racing, thoughts colliding. This wasn't subtle teenage rebellion. This was a crime happening under her roof. But this was also not new territory. Bradley had been spiraling for a while. Unauthorized parties at the house, constant arguments with family members, and she knew he sometimes associated with known gang members. Bonnie had tried to be patient, to remember what adolescence felt like. She'd offered support, hoping he'd outgrow the recklessness. Instead, things escalated. And this, dragging a stolen payphone into his bedroom and smashing it apart, felt like the tipping point. If she ignored this, what came next? Someone getting hurt? Bradley ending up behind bars? She realized this was the moment to draw a hard line. Without another word to Bradley or Jason, who had already resumed hammering at the metal casing, Bonnie walked back into the kitchen. Brandon and Candace sat at the table, eating quietly, visibly irritated by the chaos their older brother had unleashed. She passed them, lifted the phone, and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, she reported a theft. Then she gave her own home address. After hanging up, she told Candace and Brandon to grab their backpacks and head outside so they wouldn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Bonnie opened the front door to find two sheriff's deputies standing there. They knew her, and they knew them. This wasn't their first visit to the Sandborn house. In fact, they'd been out several times recently, responding to domestic disturbances, most of them sparked by her son. Bradley was the center of the storm, no question, but lately Bonnie had noticed something else. Her 13-year-old daughter Candace started pushing boundaries too, and Brandon, only 10, wasn't far behind. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen when he hit his teenage years. Would he follow Bradley? Maybe even Candace? She didn't have answers. She just kept circling the same painful question. Where had she gone wrong? Without a word, she led the deputies down the hall to Bradley's bedroom. Inside, Bradley and Jason were still hunched over a payphone, trying to force it open. When Bradley looked up and saw the uniforms, his face twisted with rage. He shouted at his mother, accusing her of betraying him, of calling the cops on her own son. The guilt hit her instantly, but she swallowed it. This wasn't what she wanted. Still, she couldn't keep living like this. The deputies cuffed Bradley and Jason and escorted them outside. Bonnie followed close behind. As the boys were being placed in the back of the squad car, she pulled one of the deputies aside. Quietly, firmly, she asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in juvenile detention. It felt brutal, requesting that your own child stay locked up, but she hoped a night inside might shake him, maybe even open the door to counseling. Maybe it would be the wake-up call he needed. The deputy gave a small nod and said he'd do what he could. As the squad car rolled away, Bonnie noticed movement across the street. A curtain shifted, one of her neighbors watching the spectacle unfold. Farther down the block, a couple out for a morning jog slowed to stare as the patrol car passed. She wasn't naive. If police cars showed up on her street, she'd look too. Still, the humiliation burned. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew her family's struggles. They were polite to her face, sometimes even kind, but she knew the whispers never stopped once she walked away. And that stung the most. Not just the gossip, but the isolation. She was married, yes, but Robert had taken a job in Maryland and only came home every other weekend. She'd considered selling the house in Tucson and moving the family east. In the end, it felt like too much upheaval. Besides, Robert had spoken to his supervisor about transferring back to Tucson. He was supposed to return for good next week. So for now, Bonnie was just holding the line, counting the days. Soon she wouldn't have to shoulder the chaos alone. The kids, the neighbors, the police. She'd have her partner beside her again. That had to make things better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m., Bonnie stood in the bathroom brushing her teeth, pulling on her pajamas. For once, the house was quiet, just the soft murmur of the television drifting in from the living room. Earlier that afternoon, the juvenile detention center had called. Bradley was being held on theft charges. Bonnie believed that was for the best. Jason, however, was 18. He'd received a citation and been released the same day. She knew exactly what that meant. The moment Bradley got out, the two of them would find each other again and slip right back into trouble. Before heading to bed, Bonnie stepped into the living room. Candace and Brandon were sprawled across the couch, eyes fixed on the TV. She told them it was time to shut it off and go to sleep. They didn't even look at her. It was Friday night, no school in the morning, and Bonnie had already fought enough battles for one day. Exhaustion won. She sighed and told them not to stay up too late, just make sure they got to bed soon. Then she turned and walked down the hall, leaving the television humming in the dark. Bonnie left them there on the couch, the glow of the television washing over their faces, and retreated into her bedroom. She switched off the light and lay down, hoping the quiet would finally settle in. Sometime later, she jolted awake. The clock read just before 3 a.m., and the TV was still playing in the living room. Irritated and exhausted, she cracked her door open and called down the hallway, telling the kids to shut it off and get to bed. She climbed back under the covers. A moment later, the television clicked off. Footsteps padded down the hall. Then silence. She drifted off again. But before sunrise, while the sky outside was still pitch black, Bonnie woke a second time. She rolled onto her side, her eyes adjusting to the dark, and froze. A large figure was standing over her bed. Later that morning, around 11:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke to an unsettling stillness. On any normal day, especially a Saturday, his mother would already be up, cooking breakfast, moving around the kitchen, starting her routine. But the house felt wrong, too quiet. He stepped into the hallway. Nothing. In the kitchen, there were no dishes in the sink, no pans on the stove, no coffee brewing. It didn't look like his mom had gotten up at all. That didn't make sense. He found his older sister Candace and asked if she'd seen her mom. She hadn't. Together, they walked down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked. No response. Brandon slowly pushed the door open. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Blood. It was everywhere, splashed across the room. But Bonnie wasn't there. The bedroom was empty. Let me shift gears for a second and tell you about something completely different. My newest obsession. Recently, I had family and friends over, and I couldn't wait to share my favorite treat, mochi ice cream. We passed around mango, strawberry, and cookies and cream, and it was an instant hit. In fact, we ended up making a quick run to the supermarket afterwards to grab more. Because sometimes the simplest things bring the biggest smiles, like biting into my mochi ice cream, that cool, creamy center wrapped in soft, chewy dough. It's like a little frozen dumpling of happiness. Premium ice cream tucked inside a sweet, satisfying shell that's both refreshing and indulgent.
All right, we're going to pause the story right here. What happens next picks up in the next video. Make sure you don't miss it. I'll see you there.